Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Lisa Stutz, the director of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. This morning, our esteemed volunteer, Terri Meeks, will be telling us how to best plan for our genealogy trip vacation, or genealogy vacation, something all of us genealogists buffs would love to do. But before I turn it over to Terri, if you have any questions or comments that you would like to share during the program, please type them in the chat box. And we will be monitoring the chat box throughout the program, and we'll make sure that all of your questions get answered at the end of the presentation. So if you wanted to test out your chat box feature, please tell us hi. We also wanted to invite all of you to join us again next month on Saturday, July 10th, for another of Terri's virtual programs. The topic will be A Grave Matter, Tombstone Art and Its Meaning. We will be posting our online registration for that in the next week or two. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And I will now turn it over to Terri.
Good morning, and with the relaxation of many of the restrictions, hopefully you are planning some sort of trip in the near future. Perhaps it's only a one-day or an overnight trip, or perhaps it is one of longer duration. But we've heard that many of the state and national parks have been highly visited this summer. So perhaps there's a genealogy trip in your future. As Lisa said, if you have trouble viewing or hearing any of this presentation, if you'll just send an email to the address listed here, we will monitor and hopefully get any of your issues settled. So why plan a genealogy trip? After all, everything's on the internet. We've heard that many, many times. So we're going to actually look and see what is on the internet. We do know that all of the census records from 1790 up through 1940 are on the internet. And at the moment, we are actually looking forward to the 1950 census coming up in April of next year. Now, the day, April 1st, is the day that the census will be released, but it will not be available on the internet, and it certainly will not be indexed at that time. So, something to look forward to in either case. Many of the records that you see listed here are on the internet. Births, marriages, and deaths, but not for every single state or even county. Cemetery records, we turn to Billion Graves and Find a Grave. Many of those records also are online. But if your ancestor didn't have a tombstone, perhaps their records have been overlooked. Many military records are online, but there are some, especially from the later wars, World War I, World War II, definitely Korea and Vietnam. They are not online. Immigration and naturalization records, many of those are online, but finding out exactly which court in which state they might have appeared may be difficult. And we certainly have access to maps, newspapers, and books, but there's always more. And one of the things that we really turn to sometimes are uploaded family trees. Even if they contain mistakes, they are good guidelines for us to do research to either prove or disprove that those folks are in our family tree as well. Let's look and see what's not on the internet that would help you if you made a trip. First of all of those records of the living. We have a 72-year restriction with the Privacy Act, so that many of the records for births, marriages, and deaths for our living or recently deceased ancestors are not online. Land records. Land records can present some information and contain other forms of information that we hadn't thought about in doing our genealogy research. So knowing where your folks lived, finding those original land records or the Plat Maps for the particular area might be helpful to you in discovering when they arrived in an area and when they might have left the area. There are some wills online, but if your folks didn't have a will, there are other probate records that are not online and are definitely worth looking into. Divorce records, particularly in many states, it requires that 100 years pass before a divorce record is published. Many of these records, the indexes are online, but not the actual record. So it does pay to go to a local courthouse to see if you can find the information. Diaries and family histories, newspapers and books, funeral home records. We frequently don't look at those, but they do provide some added information. What kinds of, especially the old records. I have a relative and I have the funeral home records, and it does talk about the horses, the pairs of black gloves, and it makes for a very interesting read for a time period when that person actually died. And the most important thing is perhaps you can make contact with some of the living descendants, some of those cousins that may be off on the side that, number one, you didn't know existed, or that you have never met before. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, where do you want to go? Who in your family do you want to research? And how long will it require you to stay? If there's only one relative in a particular location, it might be a very, very short trip. You probably, especially if it's your first trip, you probably want to think about, was there an entire family that lived in a particular area for perhaps at least a couple of decades, maybe only one decade, but the longer the better. And if there is an entire family group, say your great-grandparents, and they might have had 10 children that lived in a particular area, that gives you a broad scope of research to do. What tools do you want to take? What's going to help you to find the various sets of information that you're looking for? And we'll talk about those a little bit. And what is it exactly that you want to look for? You might have their birth, marriage, and death information, but is there other information that you could find that would lend credence to a story, or that would help you flesh out more information about these people? They lived there, they lived their lives, and there's more than just their birth, marriage, and death statistics that you want to include in their life story. There is nothing more moving than walking on your ancestors' land, walking in their footsteps, maybe 50 years later, maybe only 20 years later, but it is still a moving experience. Is there a courthouse available nearby? where you can look for additional records? Are there libraries and archives, especially specialized libraries, that might be able to provide more information about your ancestor? Is there a genealogy or an historical society that might have additional information about your family? If not your direct line, perhaps those that are on the side. Your grandfather's brother might have lived in the same community and might have been a mover and a shaker in that community and might have more information available that would lend information about your ancestor. And are there any historical sites in the nearby area that might help you understand what life was like in a particular time period for you to research? My husband calls them tools, I call them toys. But we're going to look at some of the things that might help you when taking a genealogy trip. He calls it his mobile genealogy research lab. For the most part, nowadays, our phones can handle all of these options. But if anything goes wrong with that phone, if there isn't a phone service available, do you want to have other equipment, tools that will help you doing your research? So these are some of the ideas that you might look at. If you've got a laptop or a tablet that has your genealogy software on it, you probably might want to bring that. There is mapping software to give you those global positioning satellite, GPS coordinates for various things. Our phones do wonderful jobs as far as taking pictures and doing audio recordings. But you might want to also consider taking a camera, a scanner, or an audio recorder. And of course, these devices all require power cables, batteries, and chargers. You don't want to forget that phone charger. And you might need an extra piece of luggage to carry along with you. The more you capture digitally, the more you can do with it later. You want to be able to access your genealogy, whether it involves an application on your laptop or your tablet. You want to be able to go back and look at what the information is that you have and what it is that you're looking for. If you find a record somewhere, does it fit into your family? If you've got a family member that has a common name, you want to be able to separate out your family versus someone who is not related to you. If you have any photos that relate to your family, you might want to share those. So you might want to make sure that those are loaded on your phone, your tablet, or your laptop. If you happen to meet any cousins or relatives in the local area, you might want to share, and you certainly want to get any photographs from them as well. And the best part is you need mapping. Where are you going? Where are you currently at? And where do you want? What's your actual destination? Most cars nowadays, especially if you've had to fly somewhere, the car that you might rent will have some form of onboard navigation. But if you do not have that available, let's look at some of the options that you might have prior to leaving. If the internet is available, you have access to Google Earth and Apple Maps. And both of these will allow you to look at old townships as well as the current, placement of cemeteries, and it will allow you to go to street level or a bird's eye view of the local area to help you look at various locations. If you want to visit a cemetery, if you know exactly where the courthouse is. You can also download maps. Your car's map application will allow you to navigate while you are actually driving. But if you're looking at your iPhone or a tablet, you're probably going to need a cell signal. If no cell signal exists in that particular area, you can always download maps. There are apps that will allow you to download maps to get to where you need to go. Here's an example of a bird's eye view from a Google Earth. It happens to be of a cemetery, and sometimes these are very, very handy. You see the roadways that are in the actual cemetery, as well as the plotted areas. So if you have information about from Find a Grave that your person is buried in such and such a lot or a section, you can use these maps to find those. You can go down further in looking at a larger area, as well as getting into the actual details for how to get to the particular cemetery. You can then zoom in and see the actual layout of the land. The downloadable maps, the apps that will allow you to download maps, frequently they are free and they are available even when there's no cell signal present. So you can get that information. While our phones do take fabulous pictures, you might also want to use a digital camera. Courthouses frequently will restrict the use of certain even digital devices. So check beforehand, and we'll go over some of that information. But you might want to bring along either a camera or a flat scanner so that you can collect information. Plat Maps especially are large, and if you use your phone, you may be able to get the whole image, but in blowing it up, you may lose the contrast, whereas you might be able to get a particular section where your people lived using a scanner. Here again, our phones do wonderful jobs with digital audio recording. You can use various phone apps to capture that, or you can bring along a dedicated digital recorder to interview any live bodies that you might find. Another thing that you might consider is the various memory devices. I have all of my genealogy information backed up onto a solid state drive. You can bring that along with you so that if you find documents, you can record those. You might want a memory stick, especially if you meet someone and want to share your information. This will allow you to pull the information off of your computer and share it with someone. The little cards will allow you to take many, many photos, whether it's photos of people or capturing images of documents. These will be beneficial for you. And finally, as we said, with all of this stuff, they do require power. If you're going to use something in your car, you might want to get an inverter or an adapter. And you probably want to know whether your connections are via USB or Ethernet. And as we've said, whether it's a camera or a phone, you're going to need either batteries or a charger of some sort. And if you decide to take along all this stuff, you're probably going to need some form of backpack or a rolling piece of luggage to make it a little bit easier for you. So what do you want to look for? I am one of those people that believes in organization. So prior to actually leaving on your trip, make a list of things that you want to look for. Do you have copies of the marriage records, or do you just have an index or an extracted record for a marriage? Are there land records that would perhaps give you some further information? So make a list of the things. What are you missing that you would like to fill in? And what are some of the things that you might be lucky enough to discover in your research? And I actually do prepare a bibliography for what I want to research. One of my first trips that I was fortunate enough to take was to go to the library in Salt Lake City, the Genealogy Library run by the Mormon Church. And I did prepare a bibliography listing books. But when I got there, I realized that I looked at the shelf and I saw one book that I had on my list. But there were 5 more books about the same particular subject. And I realized very early on that I got waylaid. My focus was spreading too thin. So I returned to my bibliography and actually worked through that rather than trying to look at all the side references. When you make your first trip, chances are you're going to make a second trip. Here's an example of some of the research that I did. I knew that some of my relatives were buried in various cemeteries in the New York City area. And if any of you have been to that area, you realize that New York City cemeteries are huge. Millions of people are buried in these cemeteries. While a lot of this information is on Find a Grave, some of this information is not. So I actually looked up the cemetery, where it was located, and they fortunately recorded the latitude and longitude for the particular area. So if there's any question in your mind as to where something is, record that information. I found that where the sections and the ranges and the lots where people might have been buried, but I didn't know exactly when someone was buried. I knew that he lived after his wife had passed away, but didn't have an exact date, while others were in various areas. I actually did go to each one of the cemeteries to take pictures. The old Cavalry Cemetery, if any of you have ever watched Blue Bloods and you see pictures taken from a cemetery overlooking New York City, that's the old Cavalry Cemetery. There are millions of people buried there, and it is one of the oldest cemeteries in the New York City area. People back in the 1800s used to take picnics and go out to the cemetery. They would tend the graves, they would picnic, and they would see the lovely views of the city. And we're going to talk a little bit about later about cemeteries and some of the discoveries that perhaps might not be on Find a Grave. For books, try to access your library's location and look up call numbers. You can do a subject search to see if they have any books that might be of interest to you. This listing happens to be from a library run by the American Canadian Genealogical Society. So I knew that they had a lot of registers for births, marriages, and deaths from various Catholic churches throughout the New England area. But to save time, I recorded the call numbers for those books so that when I got to the library, I could ask for them or find them on the shelves myself, rather than doing the research, wasting the time doing the research while I was in the library. So make a listing of what you want to look for and do some prior research before heading out. These are just some of the records that you might find in an area courthouse. Here again, prioritize. What do you want to look for? The records will be located in different offices within the courthouse. And I advise you here again to go online to look for the courthouse, its location, a phone number to find out, and look to read any specific requirements that they might have, especially during this particular era of COVID. Many courthouses have been closed. Access to a lot of these records has been precluded. So it is important to know what will be available to you at this particular time, or whether you will have to pay to have them do the research for you. So look for any restrictions. Some courthouses and libraries will only allow you to go in with a pencil and paper. Some of them will not even allow you to go in with computers. Many of the courthouses charge money for copies of the information that you're looking at. Some of the courthouses have the information available only on microfilm. So know this information before you go so that you can be prepared accordingly. One of the courthouses I've visited actually wanted $5 a page for copies. Plan your visit. When you are looking at the website or whether you call ahead, what are the hours of operation for that particular courthouse? Are they open from 8 to 5, or do they have extended hours or earlier hours? Arrive early and be ready to leave promptly at the closing time. Have your list of research objectives and which departments you want to visit. Marriage records are usually in a different area than land records, for example. So try to see if you can't ascertain what offices those might be in. Be willing to accept unusual procedures. We have actually visited some courthouses where you have to go down spiral staircases to the basement. The room may be large, the room may be small. So you need to be prepared for scaling stairs or taking elevators, visiting multiple offices. One of the courthouses that we visited would allow us to take pictures of marriage records. However, we had to cover up the other marriage records that appeared on the page. We could only get a copy of the single record that was on that page for our relative. And this was in the mid 1800s. So it didn't apply to the 72-year record privacy laws. So there may be unusual procedures. You may be required to wear white or plastic gloves in order to handle the records. In some cases, you may not be allowed to handle the records. Only an employee may be able to do that. Courthouses are working entities. They have daily work requirements, so be patient. People may not be there to help you. You may be allowed to do research on your own, but in some cases you may not. You may have to rely on a courthouse employee to help you. So know what and respect their requirements as well. And especially with courthouses, those county lines changed. So just because your people lived in that particular county at a particular time, they might have gone to the courthouse that was nearest to their property rather than the courthouse that their property was in. So be a little bit flexible on that as well. Probate records. Some wills are online, not all wills are online. So look for a will if your ancestor had property or had assets that were of value. They might have had a will. If they did not have a will, you've hit a gold mine. There will be a requirement for letters of administration. An executor will have to be appointed. An inventory of those assets will have to be made. If there are any minor children, guardianships might have to be assigned. And there will be a final settlement telling you how the property or the assets have been distributed to those that were entitled to them. For wills or any of these cases, there will be an index. These are huge books, and they are arranged by surname and date. And they will give you volume numbers and page numbers to actually find the wills or the probate records. I realize that you can't read this, but this is an example of a letters of administration where a listing of all the people that are entitled to something from the estate. They identify all the people that might have a claim on the estate. And this includes not only the heirs that might inherit something, but there will also be a listing of all indebtedness that you might be able to find. If they did have property or assets, an inventory will be taken, and it will list everything in the household, from beds, tables, chairs, cows, pigs, wagons, cart horses, wheelbarrows, anything that is of value, and they will assign a value to each one of those items. In many cases, these things will be sold so that those that are eligible to inherit will receive the monetary value collected. But if people want the actual item, they can in turn pay for that item and collect it. As I said, if there are minor children involved, a guardianship might have to be assigned for those children. And these papers will be included in the probate records. And there is the final settlement. Who received the inheritance, and it is a listing of all of the people, and how much or exactly what did they inherit. In my particular case, I had a relative who died in 1904. He was actually a lawyer, but he died without a will. And there was a 1-inch thick probate situation. But it allowed me to make family connections because they identified 2 soldiers who were fighting in the Philippines that were possible claimants to his estate. And I did not know about these 2 young men that were fighting in the Philippines at the time. So there you may be able to uncover some fabulous information. Don't overlook land records. They can be tedious to read, but you may also find some treasures in them. 90% of the population owned land during the 1800s. And when looking at land records, you want to go approximately 40 years past the time you think your ancestor died or left the area. Frequently, deeds were not recorded until the buyer was ready to sell, or that a mortgage was completely paid off. So just because your people arrived in an area in 1870, the deed may not have been recorded until significantly later. Here again, you're going to be in the courthouse, and just like the marriage records, you're going to have 2 very, very large books that will have grantors, those that are selling, or grantees, those that are buying. And they will be alphabetical for a specific time frame. Here's an example of a Grantor Index. So these people are all surnamed White Knight, and we see their first names, and they are arranged in alphabetical order, the A's through the H's, and in this column, the I's through the O's, and those that fall at the end. That's why we have the indentations further down. You'll notice also that we have couples. So if there's a question about who the wife might have been, you might also get her name, and perhaps even a maiden name. In this particular case, we have the estate of Anthony, and the administrator is Hiram. So further information, is Hiram in some way related to Anthony? As an administrator, he might very well have been. So, and as I said, it's going to give you a volume and a page number for the actual land description. And this is where you might find some additional information. We also said to look approximately 40 years into the future. The date of the deed for this particular gentleman is the 15th of January, 1883, when he purchased the land. But the deed is actually filed on the 1st of June, 1907. So we're 24 years later before this land transaction is actually recorded. So the index is going to refer you, as I said, to another book and a page number. And here again, these are very large books. You want to look at the Grantee Indexes first. You want to see when your people actually entered the particular area and bought their land. I was very surprised to find that there are very, very many land transactions for our ancestors. There was no fertilizer back in the day. So people, when their land played out, people might have sold and moved to the next piece of property, staying in the same county. Or they might have prospered and purchased additional sections of land. So be sure to, just because you find the first one, don't stop looking. There may be additional land records. Land records also may contain wills. If the land is being turned over to a son at some later date, it might be because of the death of his father. So don't forget to look for wills. I did see, I've seen one, so where it was a guardianship record. The administrator was actually acting on behalf of a minor child in selling land, and there was a guardianship record. And there are sometimes citizenship records that might be contained within land records. So don't overlook them. It's also going to tell you where your people lived so that you can visit that land. Plat maps. Frequently, counties create plat maps, especially for those that are the first people that are moving into the county and settling on the land. But they also drew up as land was subdivided, they drew up plat maps, not necessarily on every decade or every 20 years. They are sporadic, but they might also help you locate the land that your people owned. If you're fortunate enough to live in an area where the people had nice Jefferson system, that's these nice squares where it's section, range, township, the land is then very easy to find. If you're on a meets and bounds system, it's going to be a little more difficult, but a plat map in the courthouse will help you find your ancestors' land. For the most part, anyone who was naturalized after 1906, those records are found at the federal archives. Prior to 1906, those records are at the county level. And again, knowing which court the records were filed in will be difficult, but it is worth looking for. Here again, you want to visit the courthouse, look at the index, and see if you can't find your relative's citizenship applications. Libraries and archives in a particular area can be very valuable assets. They may contain what are called vertical or family files. These, and we'll discuss those a little bit further. Are there any special collections? Was the library the repository for the local newspaper? Do they have a special map collection? And is it a specialized library that might have additional information? Many libraries do have newspapers, access to the newspapers, and city directories certainly will allow you to locate your ancestor year by year by year. Local histories for the area, especially many of these are published on some sort of anniversary. If the community is 100 years old, 150 years old, they may have published a volume that will give you all of the history of the founding fathers of the town, etc. And we'll also take a look at Gazetteers, which are community level dictionaries, for example. The vertical files usually contain unpublished manuscripts. They can contain family group sheets that people have submitted. They can contain newspaper articles, obituaries. So looking for your family name in a particular area, these papers may prove very, very valuable. Copies of any information may have been sent from other people. And I advise you that if you have a great deal of genealogy information, send those copies to a library in your family's local area so that, and include your name and contact information so that other people may contact you about the information you have provided. And inquire if there is a special collection in their particular library that may be unique to them and provide additional information for you. Is there a university nearby? And do they have a special collection of the local history? We've already talked about where the local newspaper, those previous editions, might be stored and contained, or if there is a unique map collection. Is there some sort of specialized school or university, a seminary, law or medical school, a school where pharmacy might have been taught, dentistry, and there might be special books that will help you to find information about your ancestor. We actually visited the library at the Southwest Baptist Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and we actually found information about my husband's ancestor who was a minister, and they even had a picture of him in the volume. These schools also usually have alumni directories that will tell you, give you information about when the person attended, whether or not they graduated, and what kind of degree they might have received. So if you have someone that might have fallen into a professional organization or been a minister, you might want to look at these. Is there a specialized museum, an historical society, or an association of some sort? In Fort Worth, there is the Amon Carter Museum of Art. They have a huge library, and it has a large newspaper collection because Amon Carter was a newspaper man, but it also has specialized books about art museums and curators from art museums. I happen to have a relative in the family who was an employee of an art museum and was able to find a biography of him in this particular library. The Historical Society is going to give you a lot of information. Is there a historical society? If your people came from a large city area, is there a historical society for part of that city? You know, did the north side of the city organize an historical society? Was that the original part of the settlement? So they have particular information that might help you. Or is there some sort of professional association that might give you further information? Were your people physicians, dentists? Were they masons? And there might be particular information that you can find for them. Just an example of a newspaper article that you might be able to find in one of these libraries. City directories and gazetteers. These are geographical dictionaries, but they might, and for the most part, they talk about the formation of the town. But you may run into a unique situation where they may give a genealogy. Gazetteers cover all of the US, but they also cover sometimes occupations. There may be a gazetteer of masons for a particular area or glass workers. So don't overlook gazetteers. Here's one for Orange County, Vermont, and it's very early, but at the bottom, we see here is an actual genealogy from the town of Williamstown. We have Timothy Carlton, a native of Newburyport, and he married Polly Kaiser and reared a family of 7 children. And it lists the children, and some of them died in infancy. Others of them survived, married other people, and live still in the area, in the general area. So another possible source of information for you. Cemeteries and funeral homes may contain valuable information. Is there historical society that might be in the local area? Are you fortunate enough to, is the house that one of your ancestors lived in still in existence, or simply the land to visit? I have a friend who lives in Texas, and she actually found the early 19th century, early 1800s house of her relative using Google Earth. And the house was in Pennsylvania. So before she planned her visit, she had actually seen pictures of the house there. So look for the old home place. In many cases, I have one in particular where it's now an ice cream store. The house no longer exists, but I know exactly the address where the people lived. And visiting a museum or a historical society, you may find pictures from the time period of that old house. And the best of all possible worlds would be finding a living descendant of your ancestor, a cousin that you didn't know you had. I mentioned tombstones earlier, and I knew that James and Jeanette were buried in this particular cemetery. I had found their records, and in fact, James was originally buried in Arlington National Cemetery and was disinterred and moved to this New York City cemetery. What I did not know was that there were 3 other children in the family. So using Find a Grave, I might have looked for the initial names, but I might have not included this family because I didn't know about these 3 other children. One was 37 days old, 30 days old, and 7 months old. So these children never appeared in a census. So some valuable information to add to a family tree simply by visiting the cemetery. This is what I mean by one of those historical sites. There are many of these throughout the country, as well as internationally. And I would advise you to visit these because they do allow you to see what life was like in a particular time period. In many cases, they bring buildings in from other areas of the county or the state to construct these villages and or farms. But it does allow you to see what the housing conditions were, what occupations your ancestor might have been involved in. So take advantage of any of these that might be in the local area you are visiting. This happens to be the house that my grandfather was born in Saint Epiphane, Quebec, Canada. I had the unique opportunity to meet some Canadian cousins who took me to this house. It's very small. Can you imagine 14 children living in this house along with their parents? But for me, it's a valuable memory, and just walking in this area where my grandfather lived was a moving experience. And this is a cousin that I met that I had never known before. He's a retired priest. At the time, he was in his 90s. As the priest, this little pamphlet book that I'm holding is the genealogy of his part of the family that I did not have. By same token, because my family had moved to the United States, he didn't have my family in his book. So a correspondence was established, and I was able to provide my family tree, and he was able to provide me with his. So now, let the adventure begin. Hopefully you can plan either a short or a long trip, and hopefully you can find some additional information for your family to add meat to the bones. So we'll open it up for any comments or questions.
Well, Terry, we had 3 attendees today, Barbara and Don and Terry, but they didn't have any questions. So,
Okay, well, we'll hold it open for a couple of minutes
Yeah.
just in case there are any questions that do come up. And I would like to advertise next month on Saturday, July 10th, same time. I'm going to look into a grave matter. We're going to look at tombstones, tombstone art, and the meaning of those. So if there aren't any questions, I hope you have the opportunity to do some travel, to dig into some of your family history this summer, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you all this morning.